Hello, hello, and warm greetings from the Chennai Center for China Studies. Here we are today for an interesting discussion on the Ukraine Russia conflict. The Ukraine crisis has crossed a critical point, with Russia launching a full fledged military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as claimed by Russian President Vladimir Putin in a televised address. The conflict is now the largest attack by one state on another in Europe since the Second World War and the first since the Balkan conflict in the 1990s. Recently, along with China and the United Arab Emirates, India abstained on a US sponsored UNSC resolution that deplores in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine, with New Delhi saying dialogue is the only answer to settling differences and disputes and voicing regret that the path of diplomacy was given up. While on one hand, Russia remains India's biggest and time tested supplier of military hardware, the US, the EU, and UK are all vital partners that India cannot afford to antagonize. Considering India's strategic interest, a balanced approach is the need of the hour, and what is a pragmatic way forward? These are the subject matter of today's interview with accomplished Ambassador Ganapathi, former Secretary West, Ministry of External Affairs, Govt of India. Welcome, Ambassador. It is a great
Good
pleasure
evening.
having you with us, and thank you for being with us despite your busy schedule. Without taking much time, Ambassador, I would like to pose my first question to you. Ambassador, if you look at this issue, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is threatening the delicate balance the world is, going through right now, and more escalation can have manifold impacts on a global scale. In your view, what must be done to bring this under control and give diplomacy a chance? And do you think India can play a role here? And if so, how, Ambassador?
Good evening, Bala. It's a great delight and pleasure to see you and also talk to our colleagues in C3S and to the larger audience. It is always a double benefit to attend C3S events because I think it is one of the leading think tanks in India, and being one of its members always is a privilege and pleasure. This is very interesting times, I think, as the Chinese curse would stay, because I think the curse has affected not only Europe, you called it a European war, but it has got global ramifications. This was long coming in terms of the history of that area and the period, because if you look at it, I mean, since 1945, you had a sort of a balance of power in Europe and globally, with the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other. And you had NATO, the Western Alliance, and the Warsaw Pact bringing together the Eastern countries. Of course, in 1991, the Yugoslav conflict had more or less begun. In fact, I should say that I landed in Belgrade on my posting on September 5, 1991, which was the day when the JNA, or the Yugoslav National Army, started the unfortunate bombing of Dubrovnik harbor. Of course, before that, in June 1991, as you're aware, Slovenia had declared its independence. And that itself was a very important point of view for global politics and military history, because that was perhaps the first time when NATO was involved in an out-of-area operation, because before that, it had not gone into areas outside Europe, literally. And the Yugoslav conflict was also a conflict, if I could put it this way, between the inherent structural issues there involving the Western free market society and the Eastern so-called communist socialist societies. It also included a religious component, in the sense that the western part of Yugoslavia was Catholic, the eastern part was Orthodox, and you had Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was Muslim Catholic and also Orthodox. And of course, Germany played a very, very important role in that. And this was a year after German unification, literally, 1990. And in 1990, it's an important date because that is the time when then Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker, had given a sort of assurance to then President of the Soviet Union and General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, that NATO will not move east. And that is where all the problems we should see today comes to the fore. Even though the West has said that there was no such assurance. In fact, WikiLeaks and others have mentioned this in their cables, that you can see that James Baker talking of the fact that NATO will stop at the German borders and that there will be no expansion, but NATO may not, but NATO's role might. That's a two different thing, NATO as an organization will not, but NATO's role means in peacekeeping or peacemaking or whatever. That's what happened in Yugoslavia. Of course, within a year of that, the Soviet Union broke up in December 1991, and the 15 republics constituting the USSR became 15 independent countries, starting with the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, then Ukraine in September 1991, and all the others, of course. Then they created the Commonwealth of Independent States without the Baltic states. And since then, of course, what had happened was you had the 1994 Bucharest Memorandum, wherein Ukraine had voluntarily given up its nuclear armory weapons for guarantees from the Western powers and also the Russian Federation. But the NATO had not yet expanded. It was still a 16-member organization. But thereafter, rapidly, you could see from 1997, starting with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, NATO had metamorphosed into an organization of 16 members into 30 members, the last being North Macedonia, just a couple of years ago. And I think this was all despite the Russian Federation repeatedly telling the West that they were going against their verbal assurances. Of course, the West continued to deny it, saying that there was no verbal assurance and neither was there a written one, and that this was not at all possible. Of course, this also brings to the fore the question of NATO, relevance of NATO, now that the Warsaw Pact had disappeared after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the western part of the Warsaw Pact, that is the Central and European countries becoming independent and casting their own policies. So I think if you look at what George Kennan had said, that NATO was set up to combat communism. So if communism was not there, there was no need for NATO. I mean, if you could, and George Kennan was, as you know, one of the foremost authorities on the Soviet Union. He was the ambassador of the US in the USSR in the mid-40s after the war. Of course, there was also this heated discussion between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. Of course, the compromise was for Russia to be a member of the, the Partnership for Peace, and they also became members of the NATO the Founding Act on Cooperation and things like that. But still, the bitterness of NATO trying to move east continued to be a major thorn in the discussions between the two sides. And I think in 2008, in the Bucharest conference, when NATO literally said that the doors are open for Georgia and Ukraine also to be members, the possibility of their becoming members, this was literally what you call punching the bear in its eye, and the bear didn't take it kindly, literally. And that is where I think this is where the situation came up to. Then you had the problems within Ukraine itself. If you recall, in 2008, you had Yanukovych come into office, then the Euromaidan revolution. Viktor Yanukovych was a pro-Russian, Russian-speaking president of Ukraine. He was then overthrown to bring in a president who was not as pro-Russian as he was. Then you had Petro Poroshenko, and now Volodymyr Zelensky. Then you had the problem Euromaidan leading to the Crimean annexation by Russia. So you talked of the balance of the world and the United Nations Security Council. Even then, in 2014, the Security Council had moved a resolution, which was vetoed by the Russian Federation. And China and some other countries abstained. So it was a non sequitur, literally, it did not move ahead. And for all practical purposes, even though the annexation of Crimea continued to remain a point of major discussion between Russia and the Western interlocutors, it was more or less, not forgotten, but off the headlines, literally, let's put it this way. And that is when I think you have another interesting point from a Western intellectual. Henry Kissinger had written this article when he said that, this was in July 2014, when he said that there was no cause for Ukraine to join the NATO, and Ukraine should be accorded the facility of being a member of the EU, as Finland was, the so-called Finlandization model. And I think one of the reasons why Yanukovych was also deposed literally was his termination of the discussions of the European Union. And then you had before that Jack Matlock also, who was a American ambassador in the Russian Federation. All of them saying that there had been some undercurrent of discussion and perhaps unwritten agreement that NATO wouldn't move eastwards, and that is where the current problems have come up too, literally. Of course, then you had the issue of the Minsk Agreement, which was the question of the eastern two provinces of Donbass, that is the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, so-called, as they say, which were supposed to be given constitutional guarantees and others. And Russia felt that they were being treated as second-rate citizens, and that their dues were not accorded, and that Ukraine was not following the Minsk Agreement in its entirety. And that, pursuant to that, you had the February 21 Declaration of Independence, acceptance of recognition of the two republics, the signing of the treaty, and the invitation for the Russian Federation to help them in so-called defending their independence or whatever. And that's where I think the Russian president termed what he called as the special military operation and moved into Ukraine. Of course, what happened was it was not only restricted to the two southeastern provinces of Ukraine, but also it involved the entire Ukraine, so to say. So I think the question comes up, was it right for the Western powers to keep on pushing Ukraine towards NATO membership? If you also recall, another interesting factor is that when you had the 2014 Euromaidan issues, then Vice President of the United States of America, Mr. Joe Biden, was very active in interacting with the Ukraine leaders. And I think he had 9 calls, many visits. And of course, then Secretary of State John Kerry also visited Ukraine many a time. And Ukraine, interestingly, it was not during the Obama office itself, but also during the Trump administration, as you recall. Ukraine was very much in the forefront of the problems which in the later day became a question of the impeachment of Trump because of Ukraine and Rudy Giuliani and all that. Be that as it may, that is where we have this unfortunate situation now evolving since February 22, when there has been a lot of destruction, hostilities have broken out, a lot of loss of life and destruction of property. And the matter has gone to the Security Council. And I think the Security Council resolution, which was brought to the table by the penhandlers, as you are aware, in the United Nations Security Council, only the members can move the resolution, and they're called the penhandlers. So the penhandlers were the United States of America and Albania, but it had something like 83 co-sponsors, and the resolution was brought to a vote, but it was vetoed by the Russian Federation, and it had 3 abstentions in India, United Arab Emirates, and China. And they say that there was a threat of China vetoing the resolution, because there was a reference to Chapter 7, which is the harshest of actions against any state, and the US and the sponsors dropped any reference to Chapter 7. So how do you see this since then? Of course, since then you've had the United Nations General Assembly also getting into the act in terms of the 11th emergency special session, which was held on February 28, March 1 and 2. And I think the resolution, which was voted upon, had 141 members voting in favor, 34 abstentions and 5 negative votes. And of course, you also had 12 absentees, interestingly, which is not mentioned anywhere. I think, as you're aware, I think the UNGA special emergency sessions can be convened through this United Nations General Assembly Resolution 377 of 1950, wherein if there's a deadlock in the United Nations Security Council because of the veto or otherwise of by any of the permanent members, then the Uniting for Peace motion can be triggered for a vote in the Security Council, in the General Assembly. Now, there were 96 co-sponsors. The last two co-sponsors were brought into play were, interestingly, Cambodia and Barbados. And if you look at the 5 against, there were, of course, Russian Federation, Belarus, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Eritrea, and Syria expected. But interestingly, abstentions, India also abstained on it. India did, China did. You had a lot of countries from like Vietnam, all the South Asian countries, I mean, the major South Asian countries of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, abstained. Nepal, of course, voted for it. Maldives voted for it. Afghanistan voted for it. And you had these 3, what you call South Asian countries of India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And interestingly, from the ASEAN countries, you had Vietnam, Laos vote abstaining, but all the other ASEAN countries voted for, including Cambodia, whom you would perceive as being close to China. And a lot of North African countries and African countries voted against, and some countries, I think very few in Latin America, so to say, literally not many. Of course, Bangladesh also voted, abstained, literally. Very few countries from Latin America. The 4 Stan countries of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan was absent. The Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, they all from the Central Asian countries abstained. So, of course, the resolution, as it was entitled Aggression Against Ukraine, cannot be acted upon because any action under the Charter needs the Security Council resolution, which would imply a veto again by the by the Russian Federation. As you're aware, the Soviet Union had helped us in 1971 by 3 vetoes in the Security Council and a vote against in the General Assembly. Of course, the Uniting for Peace, when it came to the UNSC, was vetoed upon again. So that is where we are. I think, how do we bring it under control? I think the discussions, if they take place in Minsk or in the Polish-Belarus-Ukraine border, the trilateral tri-junction border, if there is some movement in terms of some understanding between Russia and Ukraine on the future security of the Russian Federation, that is very, very paramount, because Russia has asked for the security, asked for its security to be guaranteed. And I think it has also asked for subjects relating to arms control and many other things. Of course, that would be a secondary outcome that would have to be discussed between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. But here, what will happen is whether Ukraine will accept those conditions or call for cessation of hostilities as the preeminent condition. We'll have to wait and see. Of course, if that happens, there are many other issues. What happens to the so-called seceded republics of the in the southeastern part of Ukraine? What happens to Crimea? These will be long issues which will have to be discussed and debated and settled in the long run. Of course, the most important paramount requirement right now, as our permanent representative mentioned in the debates in the United Nations Security Council on 31st January, 17th February, 21st February, 24th February, 28th February, and also on March 2nd in the General Assembly, was that we need a cessation of hostilities, recognition of legitimate security interests, recognition for the United Nations Charter, respect for international law, and also, finally, sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. I think these were the points which Ambassador Tirumurthy, of all these 5 interventions which he made, this is the sum and substance of it. Of course, most importantly, he also talked of the Indian community. On the question of, so diplomacy, as you said, diplomacy and dialogue has to be given a chance. There is no question at all on it, because any conflict or any war has to be settled through diplomacy. Of course, in the major wars, you always had a winner and a loser. Now, how do we ensure that the victor doesn't glow or gloat over his victory, and the loser does not have his nose rubbed in the earth? Is a question which the people will have to discuss and debate. But ultimately, I think India would be very happy if we find a resolution to this unfortunate conflict. And of course, as we saw yesterday, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant had also come under as a target. Of course, the fire has been extinguished, but it could have grave ramifications for not only Europe, but many other parts of the world. What role can India play here? Of course, our Prime Minister has had conversations twice with President Putin, once with President Zelensky. He's talked to President Macron. Yesterday, there was a Quad meeting where the Prime Minister was a participant, where the others were President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida of Japan, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia. Prime Minister has talked to many other leaders also. And of course, he's also talked to the countries neighboring Ukraine for the support they have given for the evacuation of our nationals and citizens. So I think India can be an honest broker, but will they allow it is a question. We'll have to wait and see how this goes, because one part may not be happy with our abstaining, the other part may be quite satisfied with what we did, but we'll have to wait and see. Of course, one important point here in terms of the abstentions is this has been a question which has been asked of US leaders and ministers, as also the Australian minister. And they have said that India is a very important strategic partner for us, and each country can take its own national decision, and we are in constant touch with the Indian government. That's how it is. Rather a long answer, but I thought to put it into perspective, you needed to bring that to the fore.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You have put things into right perspective. Ambassador, speaking of security, I would like to little bit draw your attention towards India's military hardware and defense imports. As we are all aware, India has risked the US sanctions under the CATSA Act by buying the S-400 missile defense systems from Russia. But if you look very carefully, on the other hand, India also needs the support of the US and the European Union in balancing its strategic calculus. How do you see this, Ambassador? What are India's options to negotiate through all these challenges?
Yes, I think you're right that roughly, I think we used to import something like 70% of our military defense requirements from the erstwhile Soviet Union and its successor state, the Russian Federation. And this was very, very useful, let me tell you that. I mean, in the sense that whenever we needed, they were there. Be it in 1971, the Bangladesh situation, or be it during the Kargil conflict in 1999, or even during the recent Chinese incursion and attack on Indian troops and into Indian territory, incursion into Indian territory in 2020. I think the Russians were our true friend, literally, in the sense, despite Chinese objections, they did not withhold sending of equipment as required by us. So I think there is no doubt that Russia has all along remained a true friend, right from, let me put it, sometime in the mid-50s, I think 1950 onwards, they have been true friends, particularly on the defense front, so to say. Today, of course, our imports from the Russian Federation are of the order of around 40 to 43%, I think, if I'm not wrong. You are raising this CATSA, the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, was very much in the news just 2 days ago when there was a Senate hearing on India's relations with the United States. And one of these senators, Senator Von Hollen, had asked the Assistant Secretary of State, Donald Lu, on this very question as to how does he foresee the Indian import of arms and ammunition or defense equipment from Russia, and whether the US would impose CATSA against India, or would there be a waiver? Of course, until the conflict which has commenced in the eastern sector of Europe between Russia and Ukraine. So far, the American leadership has been talking in terms of a waiver for India on the import of the Triumph S-400 missiles. And of course, we don't know about subsequent missiles. Interestingly, of course, a lot of American media had commented on this particular aspect post February 24. And many of them, of course, had gone to the extent of saying that India did not deserve a waiver. But in his response to the senator, Donald Lu, said that India has scaled down its imports of Russian weapons and cancelled some orders recently. He had said that America will stick to the CAATSA letter of law. Then when the senator asked him whether there will be a waiver, I think he stepped back and said that it would be incorrect for him to prejudge the decisions which have to be made by the Secretary of State and the President. So obviously, I think he was jumping the gun literally in talking in terms of what the Secretary of State or the President of the United States of America would do. But it is very much in the forefront of discussions and debate in the United Nations Congress. So we'll have to continue to see it. And of course, it will be our endeavor to ensure that there is the waiver. But in the future, we'll have to see how the situation develops, because I think the sanctions which have been imposed on the Russian Federation in terms of the financial sanctions, the economic sanctions, and the other sanctions, what sort of impact it will have on the Russian industry, on its arms and defense industry in particular. But I think, be that as it may, I think we are very clear in our mind. I mean, of course, I don't know what the people in South Bloc are thinking, because we are around 3,000, nearly 3,000 kilometers far. But I think we are very clear in our mind that the defense relationship with the Russian Federation will not be curtailed, or there would not be a go slow. Of course, America also understands that it is also a major supplier of defense equipment, to India, including some of its, aircrafts, the INT aircraft, the various other things which have been happening over a period of time. So I think America would also like to have a share of the pie. And I think these are things which will come up, and we'll have to be prudent in how we come out to discuss this, not only with the Russian Federation, which is very keen to move ahead, and we are also very keen to move ahead, and also with the Americans. And I think our ambassador has been in touch with the senators and others, and of course, the EAM, Dr. Jaishankar, has been in regular contact with Secretary Blinken. They last met in Melbourne, as you are aware, earlier in February, for a quad ministerial. And of course, the meeting between the leaders, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. I think America would also be slightly careful in not rushing towards imposition of bringing in CAATSA to the fore, because, I mean, while today Russia may be there on their radar, I think the long-term fear for them, they are clear, is from China. And that's why they had this Indo-Pacific strategy also announced just a couple of days ago, where India has been given primacy in terms of the strategic partner, the leadership role, and all that has been reflected more than once. So obviously, this is a very, very important point. And also, this was what, when the White House officials were clarifying the various elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the doctrine, they did mention this as an important point. Of course, France is very much in the forefront of supplying defense equipment to India. We had the Rafale jets coming into India. We have had a couple of these jets already in, and some more in the pipeline. And there's a possibility of it getting more. And France has the French ambassador. I haven't heard President Macron say this, but the French ambassador did say that India has made its decision taking into consideration its national interest. This was just 2 days ago. So I think there is that balance in our relationship with all these powers. And I think that's where we our statements in the United Nations, right from the Security Council meeting of 31st January 2022 to the last held discussion in the General Assembly on 2nd March 2022, has been calibrated upwards. And I think both sides on the divide do not seem to have much reservations on what we have said, except, of course, the Western powers did say that, yes, they should not have abstained, but have come up saying that, we do respect India's position. So we'll have to see how that goes through. So I think that is where I think constant discussions with the powers that be who are actively associated in the supply of defense equipment to us and the offshoot of various other policies which might result thereto would be a very important point in the discussion and negotiations with the powers that be.
Thank you, Ambassador. You have raised a very important point. You have mentioned, for the United States, the long-term challenge is going to be China. Ambassador, just as the United States and Europe, they have grown more focused in their Indo-Pacific strategy, which has put India on the center stage. And as we all are aware, India is also grappling with the Chinese aggression at the India's border, and now the world attention is diverted from China to Russia. How do you see this, and how does it challenge India's interest?
I think one point, of course, I won't say that from their statements. I think the centrality or the central role has been given to ASEAN in every Indo-Pacific policy. India is an important constituent of that policy and a strategic element there. I think, it's very interesting in this same debate. I think one of the senators talked in terms of strategic empathy for India. He said McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, had talked of strategic empathy in not for India, from a general global perspective of US's relations overseas, versus what he called as strategic narcissism, where they want every country to do what the US looks at its own policy. So I think as they say, the debate, strategic empathy, strategic narcissism, or does it have strategic ambiguity, which the US would like vis-a-vis China, the Kissinger Doctrine of 1971. I think this is very, very important. I mean, as I think the US has brought out its Indo-Pacific policy, many other powers have also brought in their, Indo-Pacific policy little while ago. Like the European Union brought it, I think, a couple of years ago. We did bring it out. China, of course, has its white papers. But both China and Russia, as you're aware, do not like the word Indo-Pacific. They like to use the word Asia-Pacific. Now, I think they say that we should move out of the Cold War mentality. But I would very much say that they should move out of their Cold War perception of Asia-Pacific. Because Asia-Pacific leaves India out, literally. And India is an emerging power and an important constituent in the global economy and power play. So I think there is absolutely incorrect to continue to say Asia-Pacific when we have clearly pointed out also that Indo-Pacific policies are not exclusive, they're inclusive, and they include Russia and China because both of them have a long Pacific seaboard. So I think what you mentioned is absolutely right, Bala, that while the US and the EU continue to bring the Indo-Pacific to the fore, this has also been one of the reasons. I think it's not only now, I think ever since Crimea and even before, because of the internal political, the dimensions of the internal political developments within Russia, the Americans had been slowly imposing sanctions through various stages on the Russian Federation and its leaders. And Russia moving towards China is not a situation which has developed overnight. It has been there for the past decade or so plus. If you recall the 2001 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between Russia and China, signed between then Chinese President Jiang Zemin and President Putin. Where interestingly, I think Article 6 on Taiwan is very, very clear. And also Article 9, which talks of both countries getting to consult each other if there is threat to either of them, to remove that threat, which was very much Article 9 of the Indo-Soviet Treaty, which was changed in 1993. The Article 9 was dropped from the Indo-Soviet Treaty. And when we signed the Indo-Russian Treaty, the Article 9 became a part of Article 4 in a diluted version. So I think it didn't become a standout clause as it did was not a standout clause as in the Indo-Soviet Treaty, but was a merged clause, whereas it's a standout clause in the Russia-China Treaty of 2001, which was, as you are very well aware, in July 2021 has been extended for another 5 years, which also is a part of the treaty there, which says that in the event of either side not having reservation or giving notice of termination, the treaty stands extended by another 5 years. Of course, so the treaty is one of the issues, and as I said, gradually and in a gradual manner, the Western sanctions has been pushing Russia towards the Chinese political and market dispensation. Here, it is very, very important. While politically, the joint statement of February 4 goes very far in terms of talking in terms of aversion to for unipolarity, some substance of one power trying to undermine the global peace, and that democracy, Russia and China are democratic countries, and no country has the right to impose its system on another, human rights issues, and all that is mentioned. And they talk in terms of no limits to their policy and no forbidden areas also. What is also very significant is the economic aspect of it, because the current sanctions, as you would have noticed, also brings a lot of economic play into the forefront. And I think even a couple of years ago, over the last 2 years, I think Russia and China have been moving more towards de-dollarization of their trade, towards renminbi. And of course, they've also been moving away from the SWIFT mechanism, Society for Interbank Transactions, to what they call as the cross-border interbank payments system, which is a Chinese thing, and the Russian transfer of financial messages, the CIPS and the SFPS. Of course, the CIPS is very popular with around 80 countries. Japan uses it the most, followed by Russia, of course. But the Russian system of the SFPS is only used by, I think, 23 odd countries or so. But more importantly, I think while Russia's trade with China is only 0.8% of the total Russian trade, 15.5% of the total Russian trade, the Chinese trade with Russia is only 0.8% of the total Chinese foreign trade. So for China, it's insignificant, if I can put it this way. But of course, there is a lot of things, as you are aware, the power of Siberia 1, the power of Siberia 2, then the Yamal natural gas thing, the Silk routes and all that, the BRI-EAU agreements. Of course, the BRI-EAU has not moved much forward. So obviously, China recognizes the importance of Russia, but China also knows that it won't like to be locked out of the EU and the US systems, SWIFT and other things. So it is one hell of a mess, if I can put it that way. And also very interesting, if you look at it, one of the newspapers that recently commented, not magazines, or had said that even though the sanctions have come, I think Russia had been not locked out of energy, gold, and other commodities. So I think Europe depends a large extent on Russian gas. Nearly 60% of 40% of European gas and 60% of German gas, natural gas, comes from Russian reservoirs. And so also oil, nearly 20% of European oil comes from Russia. So would they lock out? Of course, they've just undone or put a stop to the Nord 2 gas pipeline, but Nord 1 incidentally is active. And what is also very interesting is the head of Gazprom on the Nord project is the former chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder. So, there's so many, in all this conflict of ideas, it's just not a, it's like an onion peel. You keep peeling and you come out new ideas, new players, new issues. So I think your question in terms of Europe being more focused on Europe and US being more focused on Indo-Pacific and Russia being focused on China, yes, that happens. But will it affect India-China relations in terms of China being more assertive and aggressive, which it has been? I think the wolf warrior diplomacy is not new. In fact, if you look at the 1971 discussions in the United Nations Security Council when the Bangladesh war was there, I think you could call them, they have always been wolf warriors. But I think you have to always, as I remark, keep your powder dry and your eyes and ears close to the ground, because I think with the new border law which China has brought in, the question is of sovereignty. And when, for China, if they bring in sovereignty, as for any other country, this brings the entire situation to a whole new dimension. So I think we will have to continue to be alert to any Chinese undesirable activities and unacceptable movement on our border. And I think this was also a very, very important subject or topic which came up during the Senate hearing in terms of China-India relations and also the Taiwanese factor, Taiwan coming into play. So I think in terms of US-EU focusing on Indo-Pacific, very important for us. It gives us quite a leading role, if I can put it this way. Central, of course, I won't call it that. Two, Quad has a very important Indo-Pacific dimension. In fact, if you recall, when Foreign External Affairs Minister Jaishankar was in Melbourne, a journalist has asked him on Ukraine after the Quad meeting. He said, "Get your geography right. This is Indo-Pacific." So I think to tell him that Ukraine is not in Indo-Pacific, I think was the correct way to look at it. So the focus is there, and that is what some of the American officials have also been talking of. Russia, China, APEC, all that will come in. Of course, Russia is not a part of the RCEP, how that figures in, these are issues. And we'll have to keep monitoring the situation. I think we'll have to, more importantly, see what happens in East Europe between Russia and Ukraine in terms of the resolution of their own conflict and how it moves forward.
Ambassador, taking cue from your response, you have raised a very important point on the Russia-China aspect. Taking from here, do you think it is a collective failure of the West, which has now unfortunately pushed Russia into the hands of China? And I know it's going to be a very tight diplomatic rope work for India. So what can now be done to secure India's foreign policy objectives, Ambassador?
I think it's, when you look at the US academics and many of those who are also in the policy making, they have been always aware that China looms large on the horizon. And China is a country which would be in the long term be a threat, because Soviet Union, following the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation was no longer the threat as was before 1991, even though the Russian Federation today has the largest arsenal of nuclear arms in its silos. But the Chinese armory, the weaponization of the Chinese economy, and the fast forward movement in the China's defense concept is unsettling, not only for countries in South China Sea and Southeast Asia, and also people in countries in the Indian Ocean, but also should strike a chord in the Western policymakers' minds, because Chinese policy always has been the Middle Kingdom concept and under the heaven, where everyone else pays respect to the Mandarin, so to say. And I think the King Emperor always is there. And this is what happened in Alaska when Secretary Blinken met Wang Yi and I think Yang Jiechi. So I think there was heated debate and discussion. And, when Secretary Blinken talked tough, Chinese came back all guns blazing. So obviously, America should realize the fact that China is going to be the the threat on the final frontier of international statehood even from a Westphalian perspective. China has undermined this. China has borders with 17 countries. I mean, okay, they might have resolved most of the borders, but even with a country with which it has resolved its borders, like Nepal, it's been slowly eating away some of the border areas. Border post 1 and things like that. There have been problems. Russia has certain unresolved issues, but the treaty does say that both countries would treat their borders as resolved, and if there are any issues, they will discuss it among themselves. But look at the South China Sea. Every country there has an unsettled issue with China, which continues to threaten them more and more. So obviously, I think the Western policymakers should understand the significance of the threat from the People's Republic of China. Of course, now because of what is happening in East Europe, I think they look at Russia as a larger menace. But in the long run, I think for them, the Chinese threat is not a thing which they should forget. And that we should keep always in our mind when we frame our foreign policy objective. Of course, we don't have this system of any white papers or strategic papers coming up. It's all think tanks bring out their papers, and which is read seriously by the government. They may not respond to it, but every paper is read. Of course, many of the decisions or the recommendations which are given are made by the government themselves, and then when the think tanks come up with that, it looks like it buttresses the government's decision to move ahead on policy formulation. So I think we are keeping a very close eye on China. We continue to talk of China being a significant threat in the Quad and other bilateral discussions with the Western countries, be it Australia, France, New Zealand, or the Philippines, to whom we are well on the way to selling BrahMos, or even Vietnam or many other countries. I think very interestingly, you would have noticed that the February 4 joint statement between China and Russia did not talk of Quad. It only talked of AUKUS. And even Sergei Lavrov when he was in India on December 6 with President Putin, talked of AUKUS and not Quad. That's a very interesting point, because when they understand the significance of India reiterating the fact that Quad is not a military alliance. So that is a very important thing. So I think despite the fact that the China-Russia joint statement talks of BRICS, SCO, and also the RIC in the last paragraph, we have to keep, as I said, never let our guard down vis-a-vis China, because they're renaming cities in Arunachal Pradesh, or doing their maps, and all that is not how a country would behave if it wants to promote friendly relations with a neighbor. I think relations with China would continue to be hostile in the coming years, because they have gone against every modicum of decency, and they violated every bilateral agreement which has been signed since 1993, regrettably so. If it calls itself a civilization, it also needs to bring in civilizational aspects and moral values into play, rather than trying to muscle its way into undermining others' security, especially those who go out of the way to be friends, like our Prime Minister did with this through informal talks and many other ways which we have done.
Thank you, Ambassador. Speaking of geography, I would like to move your attention a little bit closer home. With Russia now largely, abandoned or isolated by the West and the European Union, will this make Russia to concentrate more on the Asiatic part, especially the South and Southeast Asia, and engage with players here for its rebalancing? If so, how do you think it is going to affect India's position, Ambassador?
Well, I think let me start by answering the last part of your question, in the sense I don't foresee any dilution of the various elements which go to make the India-Russia bilateral relationship. I think that will continue to be strong. And India's position in the region will continue to be recognized by all the neighbors and members, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean region, and others. We do continue to play an important role, and we do accord recognition if there's, like our Indo-Pacific policy also talks of centrality of ASEAN, ASEAN's role. So obviously that is very, very important. So we are pragmatic as we move forward. Well, I think on the specific part of your question relating to Southeast Asia, I think I think that's where I mentioned in response to your first question, I mentioned Southeast Asia and the voting pattern. No country in Southeast Asia voted for the Russian Federation in the Security Council. Of course, there's no Southeast Asia country there. It's just India and United Emirates. But Cambodia, which was supposed to be very close to China, and by extension, the Russian Federation, obviously, was a co-sponsor and voted for the General Assembly resolution. Malaysia, Singapore, everyone, the Philippines, Brunei, all the other countries who were there, including, interestingly, Myanmar, voted for the GA resolution. I think, as I said, the only countries in Southeast Asia which abstained, I have it here. If I start from it, starts very few. You have Laos, you have Mongolia, of course, which is not Southeast Asia, and Vietnam. So you just have two countries which abstained. Of course, no country was absent from the Southeast Asian part. But if you look at it, the trade between Russia and Southeast Asia is also not very much, marginal. It's a couple of $1 billion, I think, and they are a dialogue partner. But I think they rank last in terms of trade among the dialogue partners. They are members of the ARF in terms of and other discussion points. But I think after what has happened post February 22, I would say that there would be a slight cooling off in the bilateral relations between Russia and Southeast Asian countries. Singapore has come out, as you know, very strongly against Russia by talking in terms of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and calling for, they have not used the word hostility or conflict, they've called war. And Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has talked very strongly against Russia. Indonesia had talked in terms of ending the conflict and has not named Russia. It had not used war. So there you are. Malaysia has talked very strongly in the GA explanation of vote. And so obviously, I think there would be a bit of a slowdown in terms of bilateral relations. And it will take a little while for it to come back to normalcy. Of course, the most important point will be when they have the next round of ASEAN dialogue with their partners, how they would treat the Russian Federation. Would they go ahead with it, or would they be pressured by the Americans to go slow? The EPEC meeting, which is coming up, of course, China and Russia had talked of the Putrajaya declaration, respecting it. So we'll have to see how that goes. So I think that's how I would see. And of course, we'll also have to see on the financial aspect what happens. Even though, as I said, trade may be marginal, but there are investments and other things which come up from this part of the world. So it will have to evolve itself. It is too early to talk in terms of how it will shape up as the months and the year go. Right now, it's going to be cool. It's a cooling off period. I don't foresee any strong activity in the bilateral relationship between Russia and the ASEAN countries. South Asia, interestingly, as you are aware, Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Moscow on the 21st of February, and when he talked in terms of he's reaching Moscow at an exciting time, which has been lambasted by many others within Pakistan itself. Of course, Imran Khan and Pakistan is in great economic danger of default, and so he's sought assistance from Russia, and also on the gas pipeline from Kasur to Karachi. They have a steel mill. They have some bilateral training, on anti-terrorism and things like that. I don't know what sort of anti-terrorism from the world's largest terrorist training state, but which is Pakistan, obviously. So these are things we'll have to wait and see. But Afghanistan has been an important thing. But what is very interesting is Afghanistan was a co-sponsor among the 96 co-sponsors of the General Assembly resolution and also voted for it. And I think so. We'll have to wait and see what sort of impact it has on Afghanistan. Uh, of course, Iran abstained, as you're aware. So we'll see. But I think that is where it is. I think so. This rebalancing and things right now, I think we don't know which way the balance is. Till the situation settles itself, we won't have a concrete reaction except for criticism of the action from the Southeast Asian states. And of course, with the South Asian countries, relations of Russia with these countries will continue onwards. And with us, it will continue to be the strongest, so to say. Of course, I should also say Afghanistan, Maldives, Nepal, they all voted against. So we don't know what will happen to them.
Thank you, Ambassador. In terms of Ambassador, we all know at the end of the day, it's all about economics. Geoeconomics plays a very vital role. So, speaking a little bit of trade and geoeconomics, can we assume that there will be more sort of Russia's role in South Asia and Southeast Asia, because we also take into account the sanctions imposed by the West and Europe, which is now even more isolated Moscow, because already Russia engages with players in like countries like Bangladesh here. We have a trilateral cooperation in terms of nuclear cooperation, etc. So
Yes.
can we assume it that way, proper? Can we assume it that way? There'll be more economic engagements of Russia with the countries in the Southeast and Southeast Asia?
I should think so. Of course, one of the most important points right now, there's no impact of the sanctions. What sort of, as you're aware, Russia has its foreign exchange holdings are US dollar 650 billion, of which only I think 30% is dollars, which used to be more before. Around 40 odd percent is yuan, euros, yuan. So I think there is the de-dollarization has gone on. So Russia would continue to look at the South Asian market. There's no doubt with Bangladesh, nuclear power plant proper, as you mentioned. With India, we have the nuclear power. But will it impact the industrial sector in the Russian Federation is an important point to see. If Russia is not able to produce, if the financial situation, the economic sanctions affect Russia, because I think right now, as I said, it will not have an impact. We'll have to wait and see what would be the long-term effect. How does China step in? Russia will have to divert its food grains. Food grains. Ukraine was one of the important exporters of food grains to China and the world market. Wheat, soya bean, oil, sunflower oil. Russia used to export soya bean, wheat, and others. So, what sort of impact it will have on the industry, the food sector, the energy sector? So, I think the assessment of the impact of the sanctions, which are literally 10 days old. I mean, the serious sanctions, I'm putting it. The earlier sanctions did not have much of an effect, but post February 21, I think it's 7 plus 3, 10 days old. We'll have to wait and see what sort of impact first it has in the Russian industrial, economic, energy, food sector. Then from that, how much it is able to send overseas. The transport point will come in. Of course, the Far East and others are open. Through China, they can go. Through Iran, Armenia, Iran, they can come up. I think Turkey has closed the straits to it, invoking the Montreux Convention of the early part of the last century, of not allowing ships to move in and out. I think so it can put the squeeze on. So these are issues which will affect. Of course, that is where I think if we had moved rather fast on the International North-South Transport Corridor, the INSTC, that would have been very good, because we could have just come straight down to Astrakhan, the Caspian Sea, to the port in Iran, and then come down. That would have been so good for Russia and others. I think the going slow will had its own impact. Bushehr on, and of course we had Chabahar, which is moving on. So I think we'll have to see. All that the impact on Russia because of the sanctions, how do we move ahead with these infrastructure developments, how China steps in through its BRI, EAU. These are all things which will, I think, as we go, as we get more inputs on the Russian market and the Russian economic scene, I think we would be able to respond, react, and take adequate measures for not only our national interest, but I'm sure Russia would also do the calculation and see which countries it can step up its cooperation and which countries will dilute their cooperation with Russia.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before we conclude in what has been a very enlightening discussion, any concluding thoughts from you, Ambassador?
Well, I think you forgot the most important thing, which has been the most significant element in Ambassador Tirumurthy's statement and our Prime Minister's conversations with President Putin and President Zelensky, President Macron, and also President Biden and others, is the question of the Indian nationals there. I think we have really stepped up our activity in getting them out. Of course, there have been problems. The embassy has been proactive in issuing advisories. But, when there is conflict, hostility, I think it becomes very difficult for our embassies to get into various parts. That's where they issue advisories for people to move. The western sector of Ukraine has been cleared of Indian nationals. They've moved out of Ukraine, and moved out from Ukraine into Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. And from there, our evacuation flights have been bringing them quite regularly. And we have asked Prime Minister Modi asked President Putin for a certain amount of withholding of hostilities to enable movement of our students and others community from Kharkiv and Sumy and other places in the Ukraine east into Russia, Belgorod and other places, so that we can get them on into Moscow or any other place and fly them out to India. So I think that is going to be a continuing point of interest and attention for the government in the days to come. But most importantly I think this entire issue need not have come up. There could have been better recognition of Russian sensitivities and security requirements. It could have been better managed. The Ukrainians could have looked at the Minsk Accord with a little more seriousness. I think they were perhaps too laid back in terms of implementing these, thinking that nothing will happen and the West will come to their support. The West, of course, cannot come to their support because Ukraine is not a member of NATO and Article 5 doesn't come into play. They invoked Article 4 for consultations, but Article 5 is only for NATO member states. So obviously, without Article 5, and the West has made it clear, no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. So Ukraine could have been a little more pragmatic. Russia could have pushed for a little more discussions. But then I think you can only look back and analyze. What we now need is cessation of hostilities, then recognition of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and of course, recognition of everyone's legitimate security interests. That's where we have to look at. And of course, Indo-Russian relations will continue to be strong. There's no doubt at all about it. And I think even despite the problems, we'll continue to monitor, continue to develop these relations, closely monitor our relations with China, what they do on the border. And of course, our attention on Indo-Pacific through the Quad and cooperation with the Western powers will also be continue to remain strong.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. To conclude, we now understand India's relations with the West, especially including the strategic partnership with Russia in general, go far beyond the sum of their parts. Of course, the best course is for all parties to step back and focus on preventing an all-out war, rather than divide the world and return it to the days of the Cold War. Ambassador, thank you very much for patiently taking all our questions in what has been a very insightful discussion. I also thank all the viewers for your continued support. Chennai Center for China Studies is your one-stop destination for strategic analysis, not only from an Indian perspective, but also offering a peninsular view. Until next time, With warm regards, signing off. This is Balasubramanian,
Thank you.
Senior Research Officer, Chennai Center for China Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and best wishes to everybody. And
Thank you.
let's hope we get peace everywhere, because that is what is important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador.